Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. I'm super excited to be welcoming my next guest author to the podcast today. This has been an interview in the making since we met at a book launch event in Sydney last November. We were casually chatting away when she mentioned she had her own book coming out in 2020. I had no idea then what her book was about or the bidding frenzy it had caused between Australian and international publishers. I was just thrilled to be getting the lowdown on yet another debut Aussie author. So, fast forward 6 months later, and this psychological thriller has dropped on the Australian literary scene to widespread critical acclaim. A complex, atmospheric novel that draws you in gently and gradually winds up the tension until its heart-stopping conclusion. The book is called The Safe Place, and the author is Anna Downs. Welcome to the podcast, Anna.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast, and it's an honour to be asked on. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, how thrilled are you about the reception your debut book baby is receiving at the moment?
Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say maybe 1,000. It's amazing.
Now, am I right in saying that The Safe Place has debuted simultaneously in Australia, the UK and the US?
Yeah, technically, yes. So how that works logistically is that there has to be some lag time. So when they say simultaneous publication, I don't think that it ever happens where it's on the same day. I don't know. Certainly what's happened with The Safe Place is that June 30th was the Australian New Zealand pub day, and then July 14th, so 2 weeks later, is the US, and then it was going to be that the UK was 2 weeks after that. But for one reason or another, that was actually non-pandemic related, it got pushed to 20th of August. So it's not strictly simultaneous, but I think in terms of publishing speak, it is.
Now, how many other territories have acquired the rights as of now?
I think in total we've got 9, which is lovely. So the Netherlands were actually the first to publish it. That was on the 23rd of June. I think we've got Croatia, Ukraine, Germany, Russia, Hungary. But I think that might be with North America, Australia, New Zealand, UK. I think all of that probably equates to 9.
Yeah, it must be incredibly thrilling.
Really thrilling, like off the charts thrilling. My adrenaline levels have been unhealthily high for the last few weeks. Yes.
Fantastic. So I wanted to ask you, had you written anything before you started writing The Safe Place?
No. And I'm kind of both quite embarrassed by that, but also quite proud. When I was a kid, I kept journals, lots and lots of diaries. And I do remember at one point when I was younger announcing to everybody that I wanted to be a journalist. I would write novels, as my family will tell you, on our family holidays. It would sort of get to about 5 o'clock. The adults would start putting out the snacks and pouring their sundowners, and I would kind of retreat to my bedroom or to whatever we had, and I would write my novel. And that was kind of eight years old. So it was, writing was there. It was definitely in me, but I got completely swept away by a different medium, by acting. So it kind of stopped there. And the point at which I decided to try and write The Safe Place, that was completely new. That was a totally new experience. I'd never tried to write a scene before, really. Not since, 8 years old and novels on family holidays.
This is amazing. Now, I want to come back to your path to publication a little bit later because I know there are many aspiring novelists out there who'll be interested. But
Yeah.
first, can you tell me what inspired you to write this novel? What was the spark that set you on this path?
There are about 3 different sort of cornerstone ideas or, sparks of inspiration for The Safe Place. And the first of which was the fact that I used to be an actor, and I actually left that job after a kind of series of unfortunate events. that it kind of involved me losing my agent. I had a really tough year where I was kind of on my knees begging for work, desperately writing to everybody that I could think of writing to, anyone that I'd ever met, anyone I'd ever passed in a bar that might have some tenuous connection to acting and acting work. I was writing to them, and it was furious, and it was very stressful. And at one point I just kind of I realized quite how unhappy I was and how stressed I was, and how much more there was out there in the world. When you're an actor, you can't book your holidays, you can't really go anywhere or do anything for fear that the phone might ring and you might miss that opportunity of a lifetime. So I decided to take a break and go traveling for a little bit. At the time, I was really into snowboarding, so I decided to go and get a job in the French Alps working for a chalet company in a small French-run ski resort. And that was just really for some brain space and some thinking time to kind of evaluate what I wanted to do next. And I ended up having such a great time. I also met my now husband, an Australian who grew up on the Central Coast where we now live. I was working in the snow, I was falling in love, and I decided not to go back to acting and to carry on the adventures. And one of the adventures that came after the ski season was a seasonal job. We did it 2 years running. We spent the summer, so sort of 6 months at a time, working for and living with a very rich family on their beautiful, stunning, and very remote property on the west coast of France. And that job was utterly eye-opening in so many ways. It was a lot of fun. I've got a lot of very, very happy memories of that place, but it was quite extraordinary. It left a real impression. And years later, after Matt and I had moved to Australia, we'd got married. And the Central Coast is a beautiful part of the country. I love it dearly. But when I first arrived, having lived in cities all my life, I felt a little bit, the choices were a little bit limited. I was used to being able to go to the theatre a lot. And, culturally, it was very diverse and very exciting. But the Central Coast is more about kind of surfing and families. And for somebody that didn't have a family at the time and didn't surf, I was a bit like, oh, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do here. So I do remember that even in the early days after having moved to Australia, I was kind of looking for a creative outlet. And I did think to myself, oh, maybe I could write a book. Maybe I might write a book about that house, ha ha, don't be silly, Anna, kind of thing. So acting's the first cornerstone idea. The house is the second cornerstone idea. And then the third cornerstone of the book is the fact that Matt and I had 2 children. And my second child, my daughter, she didn't sleep, and there's only 20 months gap between them. So I had two kids under 2. I was living on the other side of the world from my family, and I became extremely sleep deprived, and I developed postnatal anxiety. So I was very, very fearful all the time, very scared of getting it wrong. I couldn't make decisions. I would kind of break down in the cereal aisle of Woolies, unable to make a decision between, Weetabix or oatmeal. And I was just really on the edge. And I knew I needed to carve out some time for myself as a way of sort of stepping away from some of those feelings. But the only thing I really wanted to do was not act, but create somehow. And so that was the point at which I was like, okay, well, that book that you keep thinking you're going to write, maybe you should try now. And so I wrote a line, which turned into a scene, which turned into a chapter, which turned into 25,000 words of a novel, at which point I sort of got a bit more serious about making it into something. But yeah, so originally the story came about as a kind of amalgamation, a mixture, a cocktail of those 3 things.
I've spoken to a number of people on this podcast who've put pen to paper, so to speak, as therapy or as a way of dealing with grief or trauma. Do you think that writing generally, or writing this book, helped you to deal with what was happening to you at that time of your life?
Yes, absolutely it did. In lots of different ways and on many different levels. I think that for me personally, as I said, there was a lot of fear around early motherhood for me. And I think that writing really helped to channel a lot of that fear and those feelings into something much more healthy, more productive. In writing that story, I was able to kind of bring out some of my feelings around the choices that I'd made and the person that I now was, or, my fears of who I was going to be, really bring them out and look at them closely and kind of understand them. I mean, I've always used stories and storytelling to understand myself, so that came quite naturally to me in that sense. And weirdly, I've actually, just this morning, I read an amazing article by Elizabeth Gilbert, who talks about creativity as a means by which we can cope with difficult things. So I feel like that has quite strong relevance to the crisis in which we find ourselves, the pandemic, Melbourne going into a second lockdown, my family in the UK and my friends in the US, everything that they've been experiencing. And this whole thing of feeling like they have to somehow better themselves. A lot of people have talked about all this time that we have on our hands and how we ought to be bettering ourselves and creating. And the article that Liz Gilbert wrote kind of says, don't feel pressured into creating things just because you feel you should. If that's not what you want to be doing, if there's other ways in which you cope, then do that. But she said, neurologically speaking, creativity is so soothing for us. It's so meditative, so helpful to be doing things with our hearts and our minds and our hands. It's kind of hypnotic, but what it does is it gives you a break from yourself. It gives you a little holiday from yourself and from your introspection, and it gives you an opportunity to run away into a world of your own making. And that, I think, is definitely what I was doing at that time. A lot of anxiety, I think, is about feeling out of control. And so in creating my fictional world, I could spend a couple of hours here and there, it was wherever I could, nap times, Saturday mornings when my husband took the kids out, 4:30 in the morning, wherever I could. But during that time, I was able to create a world in which I was in charge, and I called the shots. I made the decisions. I knew what was going to happen. Do you know what I mean? But also it's that stepping away from yourself, looking somewhere else, and really giving your mind a bit of a break, which again I think has enormous relevance to the sort of climate of fear and panic that we're living in at the moment.
Now, the book has only been out, or officially out, for a couple of weeks now, or short of 2 weeks, but for those who haven't read it yet, can you tell me more about the book?
The Safe Place is a story about the discovery of a secret, and it follows Emily Proudman, who is a young woman of about 26. She's a struggling actress whose life is crumbling around her ears in a pretty catastrophic fashion, or so it feels to her anyway. And she's kind of rescued by a very charismatic, very handsome, very exciting businessman. Now, she actually works for him. She's been temping for him at his company, and he offers her what appears at first to be, the opportunity of a lifetime, a job working for and living with him and his family on their very beautiful, very remote property on the west coast of France. And what at first appears to Emily to be a dream come true turns out quite quickly to be something very different indeed. It's about facades slipping and masks dropping and seeing the shadow sides underneath the dream.
Apart from the stint working on a remote French rural estate yourself, how much of your own experiences informed Emily's character?
Well, that's kind of where I started. When I first started writing, I didn't necessarily have the whole idea. I didn't start writing because I was like, I've just got this amazing idea and I have to write it. It was more like, I need to do something, and I feel like I've been training for all these years to tell stories, and it would be a real shame not to use that in some way. I felt quite frustrated at the time. I just wanted to do something, create something, and just see if I could. So I started by fictionalizing some of my own personal experiences as an actress. I was just kind of mining my own memory and my own feelings about what that was like. Some of the things that came up at first were quite funny things, like being humiliated at auditions and castings, and ridiculously surreal castings. So I started to kind of write some of those down. And then from out of nowhere, there was a scene that came about where Emily, this fictional character that I was kind of creating, that was basically me, had a panic attack on a street and was rescued by somebody. And that was the very first scene of The Safe Place I wrote. And that, of course, didn't happen to me at all. But at the time, I very much knew what panic attacks felt like. And then that kind of was a springboard into the rest of the story. And the plot, in order for the plot to work, Emily needs to feel very lost, very vulnerable, and very needy at the beginning of the story. And so I kind of realized that I could use a lot of those experiences that I'd been initially trying to fictionalize in order to create this character. Because, of course, in those days, I myself felt very lonely and vulnerable and needy. She very much started out as me, but the requirements of the story changed her. And I think even though she does have my voice, she definitely behaves in certain ways that maybe I wouldn't behave in. She makes choices that maybe I wouldn't make, and she's got a background that's really quite different to mine. She was raised in a very different way to me.
I want to talk about Nina Denny now. The woman
Oh,
with
yeah.
whom Emily spends a great deal of her time on the French estate. She's clearly a woman who has seen a great deal of trauma herself. So how difficult was it for you to get into Nina's head and to write her character and her journey?
It became a hell of a lot easier. The story has 3 POVs. So you've got Emily and you've got Scott. And both of those characters, I knew that I wanted them to alternate because they're like kind of 2 sides of a coin in a way. And then in the very, very first draft that I wrote, all of Nina's sections were lumped together in one big chunk that kind of came about 2/3 of the way through the story, just after, there's a bit of a big reveal. It was like a story within a story. I was quite proud of that. I really liked it, but the feedback from agents and publishers that it kind of slowed the pace down quite a lot because it really pulled you away from what at that point is action that's really rattling along. So they suggested maybe you might want to try and dismantle it, break it apart, and seed it through the book, which at first I was like, oh no, I can't do that. But I knew it made sense, and I knew that it was going to strengthen the structure and the pace. So what I did was I took it apart, I broke it into chunks, and then originally it was in third person. I changed it to first person, and then all of a sudden it was like she just snapped into focus. So where before I'd just written about this one event, this one day that happens in her life that's really pivotal to the story. Once I'd taken that, broken it apart, and put it into first person, all these other scenes started coming out as well. So actually what you've got now in the finished book is a lot more Nina material. And that came very quickly, very easily. There are some of those little chunks, little vignettes that just it took me sort of, just a matter of minutes to write because they came so easily to me. I would say she was difficult to write at first, and then very, very easy towards the end. I felt like I really knew her and her inner monologue, her inner life. Weirdly, even though she's quite a kind of tormented character, I really enjoyed writing her.
It takes Emily a little while to come to grips with what's actually happening, I think, to see the signs. Do you think that she suffered from Stockholm Syndrome in some way? I mean, she definitely comes to love Nina and Aurelia, her daughter, not to mention her attraction to Scott.
I think there is an element of that. I mean, she goes there very, very willingly. So at no point is there a feeling that she's being forced to be there. Certainly not at the beginning. So maybe not technically Stockholm Syndrome, but I think at the point at which she goes to the house, she is so desperate to belong. She's so desperate for the dream. She's created this perfect scenario that the Denny family just kind of slot into. She kind of imagines herself as their daughter, but also weirdly there's a lot of attraction, a lot of chemistry between her and Scott. She's just completely enchanted by them, by their dynamic, by their situation. She wants to be them, but she also wants to belong to them, and she loves them, she adores them.
As you mentioned, or you alluded to a little bit earlier, Emily definitely undergoes a transformation via her experience at Querencia, and she's definitely not the fatalistic person she was at the start of the novel. But it got me thinking that in situations like this, and we know that it does happen in the real world, that someone somewhere knows something, and for reasons unbeknown to us, they keep quiet or turn a blind eye for money, to protect their own families, or for other reasons. And I think this is the dilemma that Emily ultimately faces, isn't it?
And that's a huge part of the inspiration for the story is, I don't know, there's a series on Netflix at the moment called Unsolved Mysteries, and I've just binged watched it in the last kind of few days. And it really feeds that obsession that I've always had with stories where there's a piece of the puzzle that has never been found. Like you said, somebody somewhere knows something, but for whatever reason, they choose not to come forward or to say anything. I think, without giving too much away, that yes, Emily does find herself in that position. And that's another reason why I wanted to write this story in particular, was that my initial thoughts were, if you yourself were placed in this particular situation, if you discovered this particular thing, what would you do? What are the moral complications around it? What are the kind of, because I think for most people, it's a no-brainer. Immediately you would say, well, I would do this. But actually, when you really think about it, is that the best thing to do? And you've also got to think about who she is, where she comes from, what else might be influencing her feelings around it. So it was really exciting and interesting to kind of explore that sort of inner debate that she has towards the end.
It was not an easy decision. I think there were many, many consequences to go either way.
Yeah, and I do find myself, now that I'm talking a lot about it at the moment, finding myself thinking, what would happen afterwards?
Yeah,
like, how would that look for her? I don't know, maybe there's material for a sequel, who knows?
Anna, did you always want to write in this genre?
No, I don't think I did. I mean, I've always been very, very fascinated, you might say obsessed with darker stories, always, since I was a kid. And movie-wise, there's nothing I love more than a good horror movie. I mean, I love all different kinds of genres in movies, plays, books, art, whatever. I like all kinds of different stories. I think it's the darkness that really excites me and really gets my pulse pounding. Having said that, I think I would say that some of my favorite writers are people like David Nichols and Leanne Moriarty, people who write in a very funny, incisive way, or whose writing has a lot of warmth. And I think that I was trying initially to kind of emulate some of that as well. I think I was quite confused about what I wanted to write and what it was going to be, but it just kind of came out in a particular kind of way. I read so widely that I think what has come out is a real mishmash of different genres. But yeah, I definitely didn't set out to write a thriller. I knew it was going to be suspenseful, it was going to be a mystery, because of the nature of the story. It's about the discovery of a secret and how that particular extraordinary situation looks to somebody who comes in to it. And it's also obviously based on a real life experience that I had, and there were certain aspects of that experience at that house doing that job that were a little bit creepy and a little bit odd and a little bit out of the ordinary. So I think all of those things came together, and I think I knew at quite an early stage that it was going to have to be quite dark, quite suspenseful.
Now, I didn't see the ending coming, and I don't know if it could have ended in any other way than it did, but was this always the way you saw it concluding?
Yes, from almost the very beginning. So the very last line of Scott's final chapter, I had that line almost from the beginning. I was like, that's the end of the line. That's where we're going. Emily's conclusion was a bit less certain to me, a bit less clear, and I actually wrote that a few different ways. So, for example, I think you'll know what I mean when I say there are some questions left hanging at the end. And I did write a draft where that was all tied up neatly with a bow. But it was felt across the board, really, that it was more powerful left ambiguous, which I was really pleased with. I love ambiguous endings, endings that leave you kind of wondering. I always knew what that final decision would be, but yes, there were also some things that I explored from lots of different angles, and I wasn't quite sure where it was going to go ultimately.
So, as we chatted about earlier, your path to publication has been incredibly inspiring. You were an actress, your classmates were people like Benedict Cumberbatch and Tom Hiddleston. Then you went travelling and you settled here in Australia. So tell me about how you came to be in this position now.
So while I was writing the first draft, it started out as just something to do for me, but obviously, little thoughts start to creep in. You start to wonder if maybe you might be any good at it. So initially, I was just trying to get a little bit of feedback on, whether or not what I was writing was any good. So I gave it to a few friends. I got some great feedback. I gave it to some family members. They were like, and I thought, if they kind of say, yeah, it's great, it's okay, it's fine, I would probably still have carried on anyway. But the feedback that I was getting was, you really should do something with this. So I remember being at home in the UK and reading an article in the paper, and it was an interview with Jane Harper, and she said, this was around the time that The Dry was being released, she said that she'd done a course online with Curtis Brown Creative, and they're London based, they're an agency, and they also, as well as running kind of longer selective entry courses, they also run some shorter non-selective entry courses, and I did 2 of those. They were very inspiring, provided me with deadlines. It started to feel very exciting. I got some great feedback on what I was doing, my idea, my material. And one of the courses taught you about how to put your submissions package together and how to approach agents and publishers. So that was how I started getting a sense of the steps to publication. And I kind of made a bit of a plan, and I just followed the steps to the letter. I did a lot of research on agents and things like that. But in the meantime, I was also thinking ahead to submissions and thinking, okay, I don't have any credits at all. So I lifted a few little chapters from the book and I kind of shaped and molded them into short stories. I sent them off in the hope of getting some placements, and I did. It was amazing. I got a short listing and a long listing. I got published in a American literary journal. I was also submitting the pitch to, US pitch competitions. There was a thing called the Book Doctors Pitchapalooza that I got involved with. I did NaNoWriMo. I did everything. I went to author talks and festivals and workshops, and I did little online courses. I paid for a manuscript assessment for the first few chapters so that was really honed. That was through Kill Your Darlings, actually. They do a really good manuscript assessment service. There's so many resources out there. There's so much information. And I basically tried to utilize as much of that as possible to keep myself inspired, keep myself going, keep stoking the fire, but also find out the steps. How do you get from here to here? And then just step across them like stepping stones to the right place. I think it's quite lucky that it worked out that way. I'm sure that lots of people do something similar and it doesn't, well, I know that so many people do it and it doesn't work out like this. But
now your kids are still very young. How are you able to balance your writing with your family responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's very fluid, as in it changes all the time. I cannot offer any kind of secret at all. And I think obviously everyone's got their own unique circumstances and their own personal situations within which they have to kind of operate, I'm really lucky that when I first started writing the book, I got a very supportive partner who recognized how much of a difference it was making to me and how valuable it was to me. But still, it was very much viewed as just my spare time. So it was kind of the equivalent of him going surfing or whatever. It was like, brain space, downtime. And so making that transition as a family to prioritizing it, not just because it's something that mum needs to do just for her own sanity, like going for coffee or going to the gym, it became, making that transition to it's actually really important now because it's a job and I'm getting paid for it. And, I now have responsibilities to other people and I'm working with other people. That was quite a difficult one to make. I think it took my husband quite a long time to make that kind of shift. Not that he was ever anything but supportive, but for a long time, there was still this sense of, yeah, well, if you have those 2 hours writing your book, then I get 2 hours to go and surf, right? And I'm like, well, no, because that's my job now. Like, you go out to work every day for 8 hours. Do I get 8 hours then to do my own stuff? No, because I've got the kids. Do you know what I mean? So it's a kind of a weird dance that you do to try and work out how you can all accommodate for what you need to do as a family. I think that every week is different in terms of how we approach it now, because writing and particularly, if you're lucky enough to be published, it's not a 9 to 5 gig. It doesn't have tangible parameters. Most of the time, there's no place that you have to be at a certain time. There's no work starts at this time, then it finishes at this time. You kind of make those decisions. And so it's good because it means that you've got the flexibility to bend your work around your life. But at the same time, it also is difficult because your responsibilities and your role as a parent, it's massive, it's huge, and you find that everything else kind of just has to, like, it gets swamped by that. Do you know what I mean? It's a really difficult thing to maintain. I would say that probably balance is a bit of a myth. It maybe doesn't exist. I think day to day we work it out. And we work it out because I feel so strongly about it. I'm so passionate about it, and I know that I can do it, and that I need to defend it to the death and make time for it. My partner is really, really, really supportive, and he does everything that he can and picks up slack on the days when I need to write, and he helps, and we work together. It's good.
What would you say has been the best and most exciting part of your journey to date? Has it been seeing your book on the shelf, signing that deal?
Oh, all of the above. All of the above. There's been so many exciting bits and moments. I think getting the first responses from agents and having those initial meetings and phone calls, and the day when I actually did go in to meet with my now Australian agent at Curtis Brown, that was a huge, huge day. That was when it did feel, oh my God, this is happening. I went to last year's Arbias, which was incredibly exciting as well. That was like a bit of a baptism of fire in terms of walking into a whole new world. That was incredibly exciting. We did a few bookshop visits just recently, which was wonderful. Obviously, with the pandemic, we did not think for a long time, we thought maybe we would not get to do any of them at all. And actually, there are a lot of debut authors in Melbourne who have not yet seen their book on a shelf at all, which is a little bit of a sad thing. I'm really grateful that I got to do that. I'm so grateful that I got to, get out there, get amongst it and meet the booksellers. That was a real special moment. But to God, it's been so many lovely, beautiful, incredible moments. I'm very lucky.
The book is available as an audiobook for all those audiobook fans out there, and you narrated the book yourself. Tell me about that experience.
That was amazing. I mean, for a long time, I kind of pushed back against it. There was a sort of an assumption that I would do it from everybody. And I was like, oh, are you sure? Do we not want to get a proper actor? And they were like, well, you are a proper actor. I'm like, no, I'm not. I can't do that. And I felt quite nervous about it. But then it kind of started to sink in. I was like, oh, I really want to do it. No, I really want to do it. I think it would be really fun. And I just got this feeling. I was like, no, I can do it. I can, and I should do it. So I went into it feeling equal parts terrified and confident and excited. I was felt very privileged to be able to do it. And it was an extraordinary experience. One of the reasons for which was, I kind of assumed that there would be a director or somebody there to kind of give me a little bit of guidance with acting. There are always people around you to kind of help you make your creative decisions, but there was nobody there at all. There was an engineer who was a lovely guy, but he basically threw me in a room and pressed record and yeah. Well, but it was a lovely experience as well, because he hadn't actually read the book, and so it was like I was telling him the story. It was a really great experience. I did feel at points though, I'm like, oh my God, I'm ruining the book. I'm ruining it. Nobody listen to this. It's terrible. I mean, I will not listen to it. I don't think I could. I never in my life thought I would ever stretch those acting muscles again. I'd kind of given it up for dead. So it was wonderful.
Oh, fantastic. Anna, if people wanted to learn more about you and your fantastic book, where could they do that?
So I have a website, which is anna-downs.com. I'm very active on Twitter and Instagram. I'm not very active on Facebook. I've kind of got a personal account there, but I don't really do Facebook these days, but definitely Twitter, definitely Instagram, and on my website. And of course, my publisher's website, Affirm Press.
Excellent. Anna, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I'm so glad we met that day at Anna's shop in Cronulla.
Yay, me too. Sarah Foster's event, wasn't it?
Exactly, it's Sarah Foster's
Yeah.
event. I wish you every success with this book and the others that are sure to follow. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.